So we have Dr. Spiers here with us. We are so happy and honored to have Dr. Hugo Spiers. Dr. Spiers is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University College London, UCL. And he's also the director of Facial Cognition Lab. He's an elected member of the Memory Disorders Research Society and an associate fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation. His research explores how our brain constructs representations of the world and uses them to recall the past, navigate the present, and imagine the future. The topic of Dr. Spiers' talk is how the brain responds to spatial structures and aesthetics in the built environment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hugo Spiers. Thank you, Dr. Spiers, for being with us today.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. I've been at conferences, real in-person conferences where somebody calls in on a call, and it's a bit of a strange experience, and it can be a bit dull. The person's not quite engaged with the audience, so I'll try and do my best. It's the end of the day in the United Kingdom here. I've just done my children's tea for bedtime and time to talk to all of you. And where you've had a morning and a sort of after lunch period, so this is probably the time you're feeling sleepy, and I'll try and keep you awake with some interesting discoveries we've made. As noted in my title, and it's just been nicely explained, I run a spatial cognition lab at University College London, but I'm also a co-director at the International Centre for Neuroarchitecture and Neurodesign, which just launched at the end of last year. This is the sort of loading site for our webpage. Our webpage for our centre is still in its sort of development stage. The whole centre is building up, and it's a collaboration between University College London, where I am, and the Research Institutes of Sweden. And my co-directors for that are Fiona Zietsch, who's on the left here, Isabel Schobal, and Karina Kalman. I'm going to focus on the work that my lab have done over the last years, but Fiona Zietsch, who's on here, will appear in a lot of the research I'll be talking about. And in the future, I'm imagining Isabel and Karina will be more and more involved. Let me start out by saying as well, I've got 25 years of working in neuroscience, trained with John O'Keefe and Neil Burgess at University College London many years ago. Spent a lot of time working with rodents and humans, studying neuroscience, but I am very new, and I have not got a background in really design and how you think about designing environments. So I very much collaborate with these colleagues here and many others to think about that problem. So if the work I'm doing doesn't connect fully to that, that's because that's quite a journey to go, and I'd like to build my understanding of that. But what I'll bring is the kind of neuroscience and behavior here, I hope. So from those three people, Karina, Isabel, and Fiona, I'm going to shift to a cast of different individuals who are going to play a role in tonight's story. Each of these individuals here have been heavily involved in the research I'm doing. I could have many more on the screen, but these are key individuals who will keep popping in and out as I explain what I'm doing. So I just want to give a lot of credit to colleagues because I can't do this stuff on my own. It really does involve this group. For the first bit of the talk on how we can understand our behavior and how the environment affects our behavior, our brain dynamics, and our emotional responses to the world, I'm going to focus on these four characters who are Antoine Coutreau in France, Michael Hornberger in the University of East Anglia, Ruth Dalton at Northumbria, and Ed Manley at the University of Leeds. The five of us together are sort of five members of a large team involved in a project called Sea Hero Quest. And with Project Sea Hero Quest, I'm going to show you a movie of the virtual world we built to try and understand spatial cognition. This project was funded by Deutsche Telekom with the aim that we would try and build a tool that would help us provide early insight diagnostic features for Alzheimer's dementia, where spatial navigation is a big problem. And we thought we'd try and do that by using a games company to work with scientists to make a really exciting game that was highly scientifically valid. What came out of that collaboration in 2016 was a game called Sea Hero Quest. And at one point, it was the #1 downloaded app on the App Store. And that's because the advertising budget from Deutsche Telekom was extremely high. So anyone in the world could go onto the App Store or Google Play, download this game onto their phone or a tablet device and play. And what you saw if you played your way through the game would be a level like this. So this is going to show you a movie of level 8. And this is from our first paper in 2018 in Current Biology, which Antoine Coutreau led as a postdoc. So what participants in this task is all sorts of bits built into this application that tested spatial memory, navigation, path integration. The main task we'll be looking at today is the wayfinding task. So to look at how people might navigate and try and understand people's navigation experience, we thought we'd present people with a map. They had to memorize to get to different checkpoints. And this is 8 levels into the game, so they've experienced how to play the game at this point. And yeah, this game, they have to find their way to checkpoint 1, then checkpoint 2, then checkpoint 3. If they look at that, they close this down, and then they get to play a little boat. This cute little boat they control by tapping left or right, or swiping to go faster, or swiping down to slow down. And as they go through checkpoints and they make their way through the world, inside their phone, it's logging like a GPS system for the virtual world. Where is this little boat all the time? And we put that information together to work out the shortest path they could take and how each person compares to that baseline. We can test this as a very good navigator. Antoine, I think, is driving the boat here. So this is a very good navigator, but someone else might go around, be less efficient. So for everyone in the world, we can look at their efficiency at navigating. So it's a game, so it tells you you're amazing, you nailed it. Lots of it's in 20 different languages. And importantly, anyone on this call who's interested in using it is certainly welcome to do so. The company Glitchers that set it up have a website that was helped develop by Alzheimer's Research UK. So a key part of my talk tonight will be, if you would like to take part or involve what we're doing in your research, it's certainly possible. And Google See Your Request, you'll hopefully find the platform and you can try and log in and register for a study. You do need your own ethics and so on, but it's there for use. Okay, so let me show you some of the data. So with that advertising budget, we were able to get 4 million participants to play the game. And 4 million participants, we'll be sampling down to get really coherent. That means you've got a lot of scope to sample down to remove outliers and so on. If I showed you 4 million people navigating on a screen, it's impossible. It's just a block of color. What I'm going to do is subsample this right down to just 100 people and show you 100 people performing this is the layout of one of the levels. And there's some of the articles we produced from this game going back to 2018, and a recent one in Plus One a few months ago showing this game can predict real world wayfinding in older participants about the age of 60 to 75. Now what this short movie now is showing how a group of people navigate, and you can see most people are pretty good. There's a couple of people, 4 or 5 people that are not doing very well. And those are useful people for scientists, because if everyone did really well, we'd never learn anything. So I'm always very grateful to people that say, oh, I get lost a lot. They're very helpful. In the middle of all that, you'll see a red dot moving around. And that is actually a person who gets lost every day at their workplace. They work in a big building and they cannot find their way. They've spent their life affected by hydrocephalus as a child, and now it's affected their brain structure. And you can see if we didn't know they were colored, you wouldn't be able to pick that little dot out. But if I jump forward a bit, most people have found their way, a bit forward further, a bit forward further, a bit forward. Very sadly, the last person to make their way to the final destination is the red dot. So this provides a lot of information we can use for helping with diagnostics, but particularly for disease monitoring and, say, drug trials or monitoring. That's when it's particularly useful. And so that journey is still ongoing to develop this as a tool for clinical practice. But what I'm going to talk about today is one of the questions we asked people. We asked a lot of demographics, was where do you come from? What's your age, gender, and et cetera. What we did find was when we looked at where the best navigators came from, we could see the distribution around the world, and GDP had a strong correlation. I won't show you the plot, but countries with a high GDP, high education standard tended to navigate better. The best navigators in the world were in Finland, but a lot of Scandinavia did very well, along with New Zealand and North America. You can see Canada coming out quite well. And this map shifts around over time if you measure the data, but generally GDP predicts performance. And this is true for maths or language, other abilities, but here we're showing it for navigation ability. One of the most interesting questions from my perspective we asked people to fill in was whether you grew up in a rural setting or a city or some mix, because we wondered about the extent to which these environments might affect the way in which we learn to navigate. So we're interested about how you grew up. So in the audience, they're listening online in the room. Some of you may have grown up in a city. Like I grew up in Edinburgh. I grew up in a city. Some people might have grown up in a fully rural environment, or perhaps some mix or suburbs. And what we did was really compare people who really critically grew up in the city to others. And I'm going to show you a plot now. And it's a plot on the y-axis, we have performance. So high on this axis is good. So good navigators are up. And we'll plot by age. So you can see how navigation changes as we get older using this app. So and we subsampled this down to just over 500,000 people from our global set. They're really valid data. And also going to separate out wayfinding performance by age by also separating men and women. Is this gender? What gender do you report? And also, did you grow up in a city in grey or a rural or other environment in green? So what we found is not a good sign of age. So as we get older, there's a dramatic decline in age into our later life. It's slightly curved. There's always, across every country in the world, a gender advantage for men in the sample, but not shown in this graph. We found that's strongly tied to gender inequality across countries. So that difference, this is the average shown here, it's almost negligible in Scandinavia, and it's very high in certain countries where there are big access to society for men and women. So that's what's driving a lot of the variance between men and women, is the country people growing up in. But what you can see between the grey and the green line here is that growing up outside a city has a real benefit. People are cognitively, at the end of later in life, if you're a woman and you grew up in a city, you're 10 years behind cognitively a woman grew up outside a city. So quite a strong effect size for the effect of the environment people grew up, which really surprises how strong this effect was. And we could see it in every country in the world. But what really intrigued us was it really varied by country. It wasn't just a static variable. Some countries was a big effect and some countries very small. And what we realized thinking about this, particularly Antoine, who I give a lot of credit, who's the first author, and we're very fortunate to publish this in Nature, was that we realized from a nice paper in applied network science that you can quantify every city in the world in terms of how gritty it is. So where you're sitting, the people who are sitting in person at the lecture in Georgia, it's a very gritty city. Chicago is another very city to the north. Toronto is extremely gritty. Buenos Aires is very, very gritty. But if you take a city like Prague or Rome, as we'll see in a minute, they're much more windy and less organized. And in fact, if you take Jeff's paper, Jeff Boeing, you've got cities like Sao Paulo and Rome at the bottom where streets can go in every direction versus cities like Toronto, where it's talking about the main downtown Toronto, is very, very gritty. So we knew that these varied, and then we wondered whether that mattered for the score. So what we're doing in this next plot is plotting for every country in the world the effect size. So everybody's away, most people are away on the positive here. There's a negative effect of cities on performance. So a negative effect of growing up in cities on this axis. And on the y-axis, we have the network entropy, so how gritty. So cities down here, like Chicago would fall here. We work out the average across the main cities for a country. So if there's a relationship, we should see it appearing in this graph, and that's indeed what we saw, was a negative correlation where the lower the street network entropy, the more gritty the countries are, the cities of countries are, the bigger the impact, the bigger the negative impact of growing up in a city. What that suggests then is that it's the sort of rectilinear structure of cities that if you grew up in them tends to lead to less, on average, good wayfinding performance in our game. And you'll see that we could separate out into sort of a cluster of companies which have this low street network entropy and much of the rest of the world with this high street network entropy. So the countries like Ireland, where it's extremely wiggly, the roads in Ireland, whereas Canada and Argentina are very gritty. So the next thing we wanted to know was, okay, it's very interesting. We found that there's an effect of the grittiness of cities driving in early life experience growing up, that this seems to affect wayfinding performance. But what about our game? We had 72 levels in our game of different levels of complexity. They vary wildly in terms of some quite gritty levels and some non-gritty levels. And what we did then was to separate out these two groups of countries. In green are the countries which have, like Ireland or Romania, have really high, like the UK where I am from, really wiggly streets. And in countries where, like North America, Canada, and the USA, where they're quite gritty streets as two groups of populations. What we found out from doing that, so what here again on the up on the axis, the higher the score here is the worse the impact of growing up in a city. And on the x-axis going left to right is how windy and wiggly is the environment. And what you see here is that there's not much effect of the entropy in the game on these high, the countries with wiggly roads in their cities. But for the ones like for United States participants who are from the United States, there's a very strong relationship there where if you're in a very convoluted, windy environment, you'll do worse on average if you grew up in a city, and it falls off with the grittiness. And in fact, one thing you can take away from this graph is that that line actually goes below the zero line, which suggests that if you were to go on holiday from Buenos Aires and you'd never been there, and you had someone from Georgia in the United States or someone from Ireland, have the one from Georgia guide you because on average they'll be slightly better at finding their way in gritty cities. So the overall title of our paper was not the cities are bad for you, but actually they sculpt you. They change the way you're adapted to grids versus non-grids. And it's a continuum, but there's that phenomenon in the world. So so the last bit to say on this is in a recent paper we also looked at the question of why are some of these levels, so in here we've got entropy in the levels, but why are some levels harder than others? So here's some of the maps and some of the views into the environments in C Hero Quest that you can try out yourself if you set up a study. If we plot the levels we tested, they really vary. Some are very, very difficult and some are very easy. So this difficulty is sort of scaled by factors, but mainly how hard people finding them. And what we did was try to take, and people at the conference today will be aware of who've been there, is learning about space syntax. There's a number of methods. This is working with Ruth Dalton's team. Demet Yeşiltepe was the key lead on this study, and so she was measuring lots of ways you could think about the environment. So here are some of the measurements she made of the segment integration, so you can divide up the space and work out how integrated the streets are, so the paths in the environment are, or the visibility within the environment. And also we took measures of the this network entropy, so how gritty are the paths in the environment. And then we asked, can we explain these patterns and the difficulty across all these different 45 levels that we can measure for wayfinding? And the result was that there are many parameters from the space syntax that don't explain the difficulty in this set. But the ones that did come out, intriguingly, one of the most dominant ones was the street network entropy, or the path entropy, is how wiggly the environments had a negative impact. Having many destinations, unsurprisingly, makes an environment harder if you've got to find your way to many places. How big the environment was and how integrated the environment were other factors that affected the navigation performance. So that's just a big thanks to Michael Hornberger, Antoine Coutreau, Ruth Dalton, and Ed Manley, who were involved in running that study on C Hero Quest. I'm now going to turn to a new study. I'm going to keep Antoine on the page because he's involved in this other study, and Ed Manley. And what we're going to move forward from that virtual world, we were studying how people find their way in virtual spaces and finding that where you grew up matters, and if the environment's very wiggly, it's hard to navigate on average, to how do people navigate a real city? And for this study, I've got Eva Maria Grisbauer, who's a PhD student in my lab, Professor Daniel McNamee from the Chapalamo Institute in Lisbon, Pablo Fernandez Velasco, who's at the University of York, who's a philosopher. Ed Manley has returned and stayed on from the University of Leeds. And the team here were interested in studying experts as they navigated through space. The experts in case for this were licensed London taxi drivers. So if anyone knows me, knows I spent a fair bit of my time in my career studying licensed London taxi drivers. And this is one called Graham Greenless, who is a licensed driver. Around if you look carefully at the picture, around his neck is a little badge. It's not a piece of jewelry or art he's wearing. It's a professional thing he's been given by the government to say he is licensed to drive that black taxi and pick up people. Without that license, he can't operate. To obtain that license, he has to memorize over 26,000 street names and how they're all connected in London. It takes about 2 to 4 years. Half the people that try fail. It's a really intense exam. And the exam they're given when these taxi drivers go to pass it to get their badge that he's wearing, they're just given 2 random points in London, and they have to take the shortest path they can between these to get to their destination. And if they do that well, they do it efficiently, then they get the badge. And they typically fail that exam, 8 to 24 times by the time they get that badge. It's really, really a grueling thing to do. So what we did in the research with that team I've mentioned was just say, well, let's examine that exam. Let's take people who passed the exam and give it to them again. And so we just gave them random points, and not quite random points. We picked really useful points across London that would probe different features of London. So they might be quite close or really far apart and on a straight line or a very complicated route to get through, and ask them to plan the route. Now, the beautiful thing from my as a cognitive scientist about taxi drivers is with that knowledge, they can tell you every step they would take on a journey. What that means is in the real world, on a huge state space, London network of streets, we can look at planning over an insanely large, in over 26,000 streets, the number of route options is 26,000 factorial. So it's bigger than the number of atoms in the universe possibly to navigate your way through London. And what I'll show you now is a plot. This is just a GIF, like a sort of animation of a group of 40 taxi drivers thinking their way from somewhere just above Regent's Park down to South London, a place that taxi drivers are often joked about not wanting to go because they lose picking up customers. But here, what you can see is the diversity there. Each of those points is where they're thinking and saying a name. So they'll be labeling the street as they go, and we can plot that journey of those taxi drivers. We can take all these thoughts, that's animated to show you, and this is sped up. They're doing it as they go. So the taxi drivers spend a bit of time thinking about it. So say they were given Paddington Station to Waterloo Station, two big stations in London. They've got to take the route. You can see in the diversity of paths. But if this imaginary route they've got, they would say all the street names. And what we found is it's about 1.8 seconds in between each street they take to pause to think about it. And we can plot that. We can plot the route through London. Here's what another route taken through London, a very long route across the River Thames. And really what we're interested in as cognitive scientists is thinking why, and the circles in this map show how long on average the group are thinking about it. So there are a lot of points where they're super quick and they don't think very much. And there are points in the space around a bridge, for example, here, or near the end, where they're very, very slow at making a judgment. Our question was, if we take those reaction times of how long it takes to say each street, can we predict those or find out what factors in the environment might explain those delays? If they were a robot or some perfect, absolutely perfect knowledge, there'd be no gap. It'd just be read out automatically. But humans aren't like that. We can't compress all that information perfectly. But these taxi drivers do something quite remarkable. They do exploit the hierarchy. So the first paper I'm just going to allude to is one we published that just came out this year in Cognition by Eva Maria Griesbauer. And here are some of the parameters we found that affected the performance. So we didn't find the Euclidean distance. The distances of butterflies affected the call out the speed at which they could make these judgments at all. We did find the number of streets start at the right-hand side. Has a very small but significant effect. So if there are many, many streets ahead, they'll be slightly slower than if there's only a few streets to get to their target. Much more slow in their response. If they have to turn a different direction, they're much slower. So which suggests they're having to reorient in their cognitive map where they're going. And they always have to indicate which direction they're traveling. So it's not an additional thing to say, I'm going to turn. They always have to indicate the direction they're moving, like forward, left, or right. We found that if they enter a main road like Oxford Street or Regent Street, they would tend to be slower, which we assume is related to the number of options that come out of those roads. But if they land on a boundary, so London is full of boundaries, and we've worked out which really are consistent boundaries for taxi drivers, they're much quicker to make their responses, which fits with the idea that they're exploiting the structure of the city street, the hierarchy of the streets, to pre-plan and think about where they're going to go, and they know what the next option is when they hit the boundary. But in a more detailed and highly computational paper that I won't go into for today, I'll just give one of the graphs in it. Daniel McNamee and Pablo Fernandez Velasco worked together with the data and take a different approach. Instead of looking at turns or streets or main roads, Daniel took the city street network, you can see in this image here, and determined the journey through it, what a number of key computational factors might be that would affect the performance. So one of those is just the as you move through the space, how efficiently can you move towards your target? If you can go straight in a straight sequence of steps to your target, you have a very efficient route. But if you have a lot of steps that go around and take different paths, then it's going to be less efficient to reach your target. And this can be conceptualized as something called the successor representation and reinforcement learning developed by Peter Diane in the 90s. It's been highly studied now, successor representations, but it's just the interaction between the structure of the environment and the reward, your distance to the reward, which in this case for taxi drivers is the destination, which they actually get paid money as taxi drivers. And the other thing is how much entropy is in the local area around the streets they can take. So this is related to the measure I was talking about, the city street grittiness. And what Daniel found when probing the data, again, looking at what we call call out time, this is how long it takes to say Regent Street, Oxford Street, Bower Street. The gap between each of those words there is what we're looking at. We're representing this on a logarithmic scale because it varies. Sometimes they're very quick and very, very slow. What you're looking at here, we've got 4 bars just to explain this and break it down. We're looking at that local transition entropy, about how disorganized the streets are around the point to make the choice. And what we were looking at here is dividing the speed at which they make. You can divide each of those choices into ones that have a low transition entropy, local transition entropy, or high transition entropy. And if you look at the low streets with these low values, and then the bottom variable that separates these out is offline thinking time. So this is when I give you, say, Paddington Station to Oxford Street. They might think for a couple of seconds, or they might think for 60 seconds, maybe. That's very long, too long probably for a taxi driver. But you vary in how long you think. So you can divide into long or short thinking times, and then you can look at how quickly they read out the streets after. And it doesn't matter how long they spend thinking ahead if it's a very easy street to consider. But what we notice in the graph is that they're significantly quicker when they spent long thinking about it ahead of reading out the plan on those high windy streets, the ones that have lots around them that have a high entropy. And so what this implies is the taxi drivers, when they're mulling over the streets, are pre-allocating, pre-planning what's going to be tricky ahead. They describe doing that. They get trained to do this, but this is a very particular analysis that's taking us into like, what are the mathematical measurements on a network structure that can explain the planning speed of X? Hello? Hello, just let me know if there's any issues. Carry on. So that was a study by this team here, particularly Daniel McNamee and Pablo. Oh, hello. Just let me know if if something's not clear or you want to ask a question. But I'll take questions at the end if that's all right. Very happy to take points of clarification as we go if that's useful. I'll assume you're hearing me. Otherwise, I don't know if there's some messages.
Yes, yeah, everything is good. We just unmuted if you.
Great. Okay. I'll carry on. But yeah, just let me know if there's something if there's something unclear or something goes wrong technically. It's very helpful. I can see my image into the room to see. So again, my huge thanks to this team who carried out that work with me in my lab. So I'm now going to shift over to a new study with Fiona Zeech, who's my co-director, as I mentioned, Amir Mohammed Javadi, and Beatrix Emo, a team where we wanted to look at not just how people plan their way through street networks, like the taxi drivers, but how does their brain process the information as they go through a navigation experience in the environment. And for this study, we're turning to space syntax. So this is a study we ran, we published this in 2017, so a while back now, but I think it's useful for thinking about how the built environment affects our brain activity. And in this case, what we did was take 24 participants, took them to Soho in central London. We had them spend a whole afternoon learning about 26 different streets in Soho. This is a really dense bit of London, and a set of landmarks they had to learn. Next day, we brought those participants back and put them into our fMRI scanner, where we could scan their brains watching first-person view videos of routes that snaked their way through the streets of Soho. The routes they experienced were new. They'd never gone on those particular routes before. They'd experienced the streets, but these were new. And we had 2 conditions. So for half the routes, they were told at every junction, you need to make the right choice to get a good payoff at the end of this experiment. So it's going to give you the options of what choice to make. And then the route will carry on once you made a response. It actually took exactly the same route for every participant, but they were making decisions about what way they would go. And the other half of trials, it was identical scenario, but there was a sat nav running. They just told them which way to go. So when you got to the junction, it would say turn left, and they had to press the left button to turn if that was the case. So we had people's brain activity while they experienced a whole sequence of routes through a dense city street network, which they had just learned the day before. And what we did then was apply a set of graph theoretic analyses from space syntax to the global area of London and the little area shown in white of the bit of Soho we're studying. So the metric here shown is the closeness centrality is a standard graph theoretic measurement for graphs, but in space syntax terms, that's the integration or segment integration. So you can see there are bits that are highly integrated and bits that are less integrated. So Oxford Street running across the top is a highly integrated road, and we know a lot of traffic and activities will occur on integrated streets. Another measure is betweenness centrality of how often you would go through any street if you're going to any other street in the environment. So Oxford Street, shown running across the top, is very, very highly integrated here. And streets that are kind of like dead ends or further away in the network will tend to be less, have a lower betweenness centrality score. In space syntax terms, this is described as a choice variable. Not sure why they came up with that term, but that's the label. And the last one, the simplest one, is just degree centrality in the network of just how many streets are connected to the current street you happen to be on. And this is called connectivity in space syntax. So you can see for our area of Soho, we have these three different measures, and they were dissociable. So we could see what's happening in the brain as you move along a street. Betweenness centrality, degree centrality, and closeness centrality are all dissociated, even in this little bit of Soho. And you can see there are areas like there's a bit in London called Seven Dials, where there are 6 different streets coming off, or there's a high degree of connectivity there. So here in our paper, just showing one of the figures where we have an axiometric projection of a bit of Soho. You can see some of the streets, Soho Square, Oxford Street running across the top. And shown in the colors is one of the routes participants experienced. They started here, they watched a movie that took them to left, then right, then forward, left, then right, forward, and finally right, where they arrived at their destination. The colors in this case represent the degree what the degree centrality or the connectivity was. At the beginning of the journey, it's very high, and towards the end, it's high, but in the middle, it's dropped. This is just one route, but there were, 12 different routes that each participant would have experienced in this format, having to navigate, and 12 having to use a sat nav. So for this one, we can see that there is increases and decreases in the degree centrality along that journey. And crucially, I wouldn't be telling you this if we didn't find something interesting, which was that the posterior right hippocampus showed activity that increased with the increasing degree centrality and decreased when it decreased. What does that mean? It means that if a person was watching the movie trying to find their way through the city streets, if they entered like a dead-end street, the hippocampal activity would dampen. If they entered a street with like 6 different options of how you could navigate from that street, the hippocampal activity went up. So this fits with a lot of past literature indicating that the posterior hippocampus in humans plays an important role in navigation and memory. In fact, we know this particular highlighted point becomes larger in people like Graham Greenlist, the licensed London taxi driver. Some key work by Eleanor Maguire in early 2000 has been replicated, shows this area is really important for navigation. So that makes sense. But what I quite liked about the results was that you see nothing in the sat-nav condition. So there's no correlation whatsoever with this spatial metric when people are told which way to go. It's only when they are actually choosing which way to go. And we can see that the only bit of the brain that is tracking the degree centrality when navigating more than the sat-nav condition or control condition is the right posterior hippocampus, a pretty focal response in the brain. We also only found this was the case that when they entered a street, so when people went into a new street, there was an increase in the activity, but it didn't happen in the middle of the street or when they had to make a choice. It's something about seeing a new view. If it has a lot of connections, there'll be more activity. If there's not enough connections, it'll be lower. Okay, so, and also to say that it's very focal to the degree centrality in the posterior hippocampus. We did not find these more larger scale connective measures drove activity. So we can A, get at what's happening in the brain, when in the environment, and what information is the activity linked to. I think for me, that's the value of brain imaging for thinking about the built environment here, is that we can ask things. You can't ask people every second, what are you thinking about? And they're not aware of what their brain is doing to plan. It's very hard to get at that. But what we're showing here is a part of the brain, it seems its activity is correlated with some very important measures that are derived not from neuroscience, but from people working in the built environment and arguing that graph theoretic measures are important. Interestingly, the anterior hippocampus, which appears to have a more role in global memory representations, was activated by the closeness centrality, how integrated those streets were. And it's something we've been exploring in further work that I won't have time to mention here. So we do have this dissociation. So for example, if we take that measure of that anterior hippocampus, if we were to take someone's brain as they walked all around Manhattan or Warsaw or Lisbon, you could work out where their anterior hippocampus would be most excited, and shows here the kind of hotspots in the environment, just to give an indication of what that result means. That from reading it, if we had enough information, which you're never really going to get, but theoretically you could map out the space from monitoring someone's brain. Last bit from this study, there was actually a suggestion from one of the reviewers when we went through the review process, was we could look at planning in a bit more detail. And what we realize is that when people are given a detour in the environment, so sometimes they can't go the direction they want to go, when they next go into the, once they have this detour, sometimes there's not many options ahead of them, but sometimes there might be more options. So this is just two examples where there are a number of ways you could go through this street network to get to your destination. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's large, and we wonder, is there a bit of the brain that processes the demands in the street network ahead? And we didn't find the hippocampus was interested, but rather the lateral prefrontal cortex bilaterally showed a really nice, significant, and quite clean correlation with this measure. So what this suggests is that if you're walking along a route and suddenly police officer says, no, you can't go down here, take another route, when your brain has to rethink about the space, if it's obvious there's just one route you can take, you will not engage the activity in your prefrontal cortex. But if the police officer stops you and you have to, then there's a lot of options you're going to have to think your way through, then you will tend to get more bilateral prefrontal cortical activity. And this is an area long known to be involved in planning across lots of different types of tasks, not just space, but planning in general. So that was work done by Fiona Zeech, Amir, and Beatrix in our team, and many others were involved in that study, but these are the key people driving that. And I keep Fiona Zeech on the screen because she is involved in the next study I'm going to mention, along with Lara Gregorians, Zita Patai, and Pablo Fernandez Velasco. So as a team, we came together to try and take the next step, which is in that study on Soho, we looked at geometry and how that drove brain activity. But our brain doesn't just respond to the geometry of the environment when we're experiencing the built environment. Our brain also is involved in the emotive experience, the aesthetics. And we wanted to try and get at how different brain systems might be driven by the structure of the environment and by your personal reaction to it. How do you feel about the environment? So this is the first step towards doing that. And we'll present some brain imaging data, which is under review, but is really just taking its first baby steps. There's so much more we can do with this. So just be aware, this is really just our first step. So this is very much work done by Lara Gregorians when she was a PhD student in my lab before going off to Christoph Holscher's lab in Singapore. So what was shown here are two movies. What we did was scour the web for 6 months to find first-person view movies. This is during lockdown, so we needed to find a way to simulate environments. And we wanted to find environments that people on average we thought would find aesthetically pleasing, and environments people would typically find displeasing or unpleasant. And shown at the top here is one of the ones that participants, 72 people go through and rate these movies. They had a whole batch of about 60 movies or so. And people consistently liked being in the Maldives versus being in some underground disgusting bunker, less like a place they would like to be in. And so what we did was collate lots of different movies and have them all ranked between ones that were, and try and create movies from a set that we would test people on, which were really pretty clearly nice or not nice. Like the people were rating on a 7-point scale. 7, I find this very, very highly pleasant, or 1, I find this very unpleasant, and somewhere in between on that scale. And so what we did in this study, here's some frames. I can't show you all the places we used, but they varied in terms of they were indoor, most of them are indoor spaces. They all contained architecture within them. They're all built environment. We have bits of green space in them. We tried to put some positive green spaces in and also some not very nice green spaces in there. So it really mixed in the different types of materials. Some are more wiggly than others. You'll see some in a minute that are more wiggly. We tried to make sure all these variables were accounted for as much as possible. Not only did we systematically vary the valence of the movies we used in our experiment, but we also looked at the complexity. So we wanted to create a 2x2 design where there are positive movies. So the bottom one here is a positive space, but it's also a very simple space. So watching a sort of wedding venue, there's only two rooms, there's one door out of there, there's not much you can do. In the top movie, you can see this one's a bit more shaky and they vary. There's a lot of ways you can move around this weird environment. You see all sorts of places appearing and the views into spaces, they vary. So we had positive movies, negative movies. We had complex movies, simple movies. I mean, complex and simple just related to the layout. So what we did then was have participants rate these movies, and we were able to find out, and here's just some examples of very simple environments with tunnels, and most complicated ones might be a large prison with millions of doors you could possibly move into, and things fell on a scale between those two. And we published our first paper on this in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. And what the key finding of that paper was that when we asked people to rate lots of different aspects of these movies, we're able to replicate some nice work by Anyan Chatterjee and colleagues about the fact you get this group of hominess and coherence and valence all linking up as a group when you ask people about how much they like these spaces, how coherent they feel, and how much they feel like a home. But in our study, they all linked to fascination. So everything was positively correlated in this network. So places that were deemed to be positive tended to be more fascinating, tend to be more homey, tend to be more coherent. And arousal was kept separate. We asked people how arousing they found these places. So they might be finding it really boring or really engaging. What you can see in this network is that the complexity, how complicated they rated things, only really related to fascination and arousal. So more complicated spaces tend to be slightly more fascinating and slightly more arousing. Okay, so that was kind of understanding the movies. What I'm going to show you now is what we found in the brain. So we had people lie in the MRI scanner. And I'll go back just to explain first. So people lay in the MRI scanner and they saw these 40-second movie clips, and they'd see a whole set of 40 of these. And we counterbalance the order of these was shown across two groups of participants. And we counterbalance that with the task they were asked to do while they were having fMRI data collected. So for a given movie, half our participants would rate that as they're watching what the valence was. Did they like it or dislike the space? And another group for the same movie would rate it for how complicated they found it on a 1 to 5 scale. So overall, every movie was, so each person saw these two tasks alternated so that for every movie we could get judgments on how much people liked them or found them complicated. What that did is meant we can look through brain activity from people watching first-person view movies through spaces they'd never seen and see which brain areas are more active for positive than negative or complex than simple spaces. And then look also when they came out the scanner, we asked, do you remember these spaces? So we could look at that. So what we found for complex spaces, I was very happy to see when we ran our analysis because I saw lots of things familiar to me. So if you look at brain areas that are more active or complicated spaces that are viewed compared to simple spaces, we see activity in the parahippocampal cortex, just edging into the hippocampus, but also the retrosplenial cortex. So these are core bits of the brain to do with spatial navigation and processing space. And there are some other ventral areas in the brain. So very much activating part of a network of brain areas known to be important for navigating when you look at complexity. So that kind of is not surprising, but makes sense. But we don't get any kind of any areas involved in valence processing linked to complexity whatsoever. It's completely distinct. However, when we turn to valence, how much people like the spaces, we found very little in the brain. Nothing significant appeared for negative spaces, which was very surprising to me because we've made some quite unpleasant movies. But what drove brain activity significantly was positive spaces. So here we found a whole swathe of activity in the posterior ventral visual areas of the brain, which may relate to the stimuli. We tried to account for a whole range of aspects of the stimuli, but effectively, I think these positive movies are more engaging for participants. Crucially, in the ventral part of the prefrontal cortex, the medial ventral part of the prefrontal cortex, an area was active for positive architectural spaces that appears in all these classic famous studies looking at valence. So if you're giving people more positive smells, more money, some water, different amounts of water when they're deprived of water, you will see that the activity in the ventromedial PFC is activated by the increase in the thing they want to have. And so this relates very much to subjective ratings of things. But here, what we're finding is just more activity there for positive than negative movies. What we could do then is look at the task. So I'm just at the bottom here, keeping that result on for the stimuli, but in the top, what I'm showing is when we look at what brain areas are active for thinking about valence, we could see very much key areas here. If anyone that knows brain imaging will spot immediately that the areas we're activating in the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate are areas in the default mode network, at least default mode C of the brain, which is linked to mind wandering and introspective thinking. And this ventromedial area overlaps somewhat when people are solving this valence problem with the raw activated by the stimuli response. So people are in nice spaces activating their prefrontal cortex in the ventromedial, and when they're thinking about whether it's nice, there's also increased activity in this region. For spatial complexity, got a very boring result, just saying that the areas associated eye movements were more active when people had to think about how complex the space was. So I was a bit disappointed by that result, to be honest. So we're waiting to look through the data in a lot more detail, but currently the results are on the bioRxiv. If you look under Gregorians, look on my Google Scholar page, you'll find our current paper on this. Just last result from this I did like was that when we looked at the participants after the scanner, they came out of the scanner, we asked them to free recall, and then we showed them little new movie snippets, just like the one I'm playing, 3 seconds of the beginning of a movie, and then said, right, oops, sorry. Please, can you tell me what happens next? And we could then listen to the narrative they described and determine whether they did or did not remember that movie. What we then did is to look back at their activity in their brain and see that the hippocampus, this bit that's involved in memory and navigation, was particularly more active when viewing in the built environment that an environment people remembered later. So it suggests you walk into a museum and you experience a new space and you really remember it. Your hippocampus and your parahippocampus will be more active if you then go on to remember it. They're encoding that information. There's something about their activity then. And this replicates work going back to 1998 in the neuroimaging world, but now showing it for movies of built environment spaces. So that was work with Fiona Zeech, Pablo Fernandez Velasco, Eva Patay, and crucially, Lara Gregorians, who ran that. So the last bit of my talk tonight, or your afternoon, but from my end of day, is to reflect on the fact that's great, we're looking at brain activity in the built environment, but it's inside an MRI scanner and people are lying there still, they're not actually experiencing, they can't walk around, they're fixed. And that's the problem with fMRI. And it is still very useful for understanding the built environment. And I do think when you're experiencing movies, you can get a lot out of people. But with the research we're doing, we're really interested, certainly with a new center, of going beyond that and trying to understand how people behave, feel, and their brain dynamics in the real world, in real spaces. And for this last study I'm going to talk about, this was done again with Fiona Zeech, my co-director at our new center for neuroarchitecture and neurodesign. And our close collaborators, Professor Stephen Gage, Professor Sean Hanna, and Professor Nick Tyler. And Nick, at the bottom here, runs a facility called the People Environment Activity Research Laboratory, or PEARL. And Sean and Stephen and Fiona are in the Bartlett School of Architecture, and I'm the neuroscientist coming in. So Nick is in engineering, and they are all in architecture. And we all came together at Nick's facility to answer this question. We look at this image of Piccadilly Circus in London. Is that in my career studying Sea Hero Quest, 4 million participants, or that movie, people watching movies, it's all individuals, all on their own, experiencing a space. But the real world out there is not. And I can see in the audience in the camera, there's a group of you sitting in a room together. Um, we all influence each other, how we make our choices in space. And can we understand that? How do crowds affect our navigation or our spatial experience and our brain activity? So to do that, we conducted our research at Nick Tyler's lab in London. This is Pearl. This is the front gate you arrive when you arrive at Pearl, and it is a 50 million pound laboratory. It's a carbon neutral building. There's no energy. All of the energy is generated by the solar and other features. And you could drive a 747 aircraft through the middle of this space. It has 40,000 square meters of modifiable space. So here's a view into one part of Pearl. It's absolutely huge. So we took a fragment of this space and came together with the team there to build our own mini art gallery. We thought it'd be fun to run an experiment in an art gallery in which we had designed from, that wasn't there the day before. We build the art gallery and then we test people in this large art gallery. So here's a top-down view into the art gallery we built. Now we wanted to be able to modify this art gallery, like, quickly to make a change to it, to the space, the layout. Do that, we use large, thick theatrical curtains. We use video displays of artwork in the space. And just, you can't see her detail, but this is Becky who runs Pearl and makes sure everything operates. It's like a full theatrical production. Above, what you can't see above these walls that can be moved are a set of 12 cameras tracking everybody who's moving in the space. And we put on ultra wideband tracking systems into everybody who is, well, put it into their hats, not into their bodies, but we put on tracking systems, 2 different tracking systems. So to do the camera view, we had people wear these ridiculous looking hats. So they're wearing a hat that has a QR code on the top and a QR code on the front. And that meant when from our 12 different cameras on the top, we could track every single person moving around. And what we did was get 102 people on the day to come in, fill out forms all about their personal demographic background, do a set of experiments within this maze, and then tell us about how they felt about that. And for some people, a subgroup of 3 participants to do a feasibility study, we used high density 64 channel EEG that was brought in by Brain Products to help us. And Klaus Gramann flew in from Berlin, where he runs his Moby body imaging lab. So hugely indebted to Klaus and the team. We also had 6 people with mobile eye tracking in there, and a set of people with recording devices to measure heart rate and so on. But we're looking to go back and do a full, we need a sample of 20 participants really with EEG to actually make inferences about that. But so far we're looking at the feasibility. What I'm going to talk about to wrap up is what we can see in the data, what the data looks like for this study. So here's our participants, 102 of them, all sitting in a room, all filling out questions about what's your back? Did you grow up in a city or outside a city? What's your age? What's your height? Do you play a lot of video games? Do you sleep much? Factors that we know affect navigation. I'll just briefly show some eye tracking footage of what it's like in the environment, so you can see that. And I'll last wrap up for time with, let me see, some tracking footage that you can see from so you can see 100 people walking through this space, and it is that data we are pulling apart. And you can see all the trails of people moving. So right now we are in the process of analyzing that data. And let me see if I got a last image, I think of, yeah. These are so that was tracking footage in the ultra wideband. Here's the video footage of people standing around gathering. So on that note, just to give you some last plot of something from it is the extent to which people found exploring the environment stressful or navigating the environment stressful on a 1 to 10 scale. And they really differ. People don't find navigation as pleasant as exploring, which makes sense, but we're interested in how that relates to the behavior in there. But there's many, many variables there we're looking through, and we'll continue to do so. So here's the full cast of characters who assisted with the research. I'll leave them on the screen and take questions, but I'd just like to end with saying Sea Hero Quest is there for people to make use of if they want to, and we'd love to collaborate with people on our large, massive data set we collected. We don't want to just sit on it. We'd love to work with other people who'd be interested to work with us on that data. So yes, I'm aware I've got not a huge amount of time left for questions, but I'm really keen to see if anybody does have some interesting questions or any questions they'd like to ask me. Thank you.